Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. We are really excited to be hosting this webinar for Pride Month, Preserving LGBTQ History. My name is Katie Peace. I'm the Director of Communications for the Preservation League of New York State. If you have found your way to this webinar but are not familiar with the League, we are New York's statewide nonprofit focused on investing in people and projects that champion the essential role of preservation in community revitalization, sustainable economic growth, and the protection of our historic buildings and landscapes. The League does this through a wide variety of programming, including offering technical services. We make grants. We have a 7 to Save program of endangered historic sites. We do public policy and advocacy on local, state, and federal levels. We host our annual Excellence in Historic Preservation Awards, which we are currently accepting nominations for. So that closes on Friday. So get those in if you know of an excellent project across the state. And we also have a lot of public programs, everything from historic tax credit webinars. We host a monthly book club. And of course, we do webinars like this one. And so I'm really excited to be welcoming our panel today. We have a great group of people who will be talking to you. I'm going to give brief intros of these folks. Amanda Davis is the project manager of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. They are a nonprofit organization that the League was honored to recognize with an Excellence Award back in 2019. She has written National Register nominations, and she's overseen documentation initiatives since the project's founding in 2015. She was also named to the National Trust's inaugural 40 Under 40 list for her efforts to help tell America's full story. So we're excited to hear from her and hear what the LGBT Historic Sites Project is doing these days. Free Harris is an independent historian and preservation consultant who works with historic preservation organizations, historic sites, nonprofits, and academic institutions on preservation issues related to diversity and interpretation. Free sits on Virginia's Board of Historic Resources and is board chair of the Rainbow Heritage Network, a national organization that seeks to preserve historic sites related to the LGBTQ community. He also contributed to the National Park Service's LGBTQ Heritage Theme Study, and I'll make sure to link his article in the chat after I turn my camera off. Then we'll hear from Dr. Jeff Javanoni, a lecturer in history and coordinator of the Women's and Gender Studies program at SUNY Fredonia. He's currently working on a book about Buffalo's gay liberation movement and writes a blog series called Gay Places for Preservation Buffalo Niagara that documents LGBTQ historic resources in Western New York. And then after our three panelists present, they will all be joined by Larry Francer for a moderated group discussion. Larry is Associate Director of the Landmark Society of Western New York. And in 2016, he launched their LGBTQ Landmarks Initiative to educate the Rochester community about the history of their local LGBTQ movement. So we're really excited to have Larry kind of rein in this conversation. I think it's going to be a really good one, so I'm excited that you are here to hear it. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. So the chat will be open. I will be there to answer general questions, share helpful links as they come up. But as our presenters are speaking, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. Larry will be looking through those questions and incorporating as many of them as possible during the group discussion at the end. And I know people always ask this, so yes, this is being recorded. It is being live streamed on our Facebook page, so you can find it there. It will also be up on our YouTube channel within the next day or two, so subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll always see our newest videos, but it will be there as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda.
Hey, thanks, Katie. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Davis, as Katie mentioned, the project manager of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. So I'm thrilled to say that the project officially turns 6 years old this summer. We were founded in 2015. And during this time, we've documented over 350 historic sites in all 5 boroughs of New York City. And these are meant to recognize not only LGBT specific history, but also the community's influence on America. We pin our findings to a map on our homepage using 8 site types that you see on your right. and these range from the 17th century to the year 2000. The goal of the project is to broaden people's knowledge of the city's LGBT history beyond the globally recognized Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, and in doing so, help push the conversation forward in rethinking how we interpret historic sites, whose narratives we leave out of these places and why, and how the public, particularly LGBTQ youth, benefits when we tell these largely untold histories. We use this slide of sites associated with James Baldwin that you see here as part of an educational guide for high school students and teachers in partnership with the city's Department of Education. Baldwin is taught in the school system's curriculum, and we wanted students and teachers to think about how these sites and the neighborhoods they're in helped shape his life as a gay Black writer and activist. Our website also features 30 curated collections that organize sites by theme, allowing people to explore LGBT history through various time periods, such as pre-20th century history or activism before Stonewall, groups of people, such as transgender history or communities of color, geographic locations, such as activism outside Manhattan, or cultural and artistic movements, such as the Harlem Renaissance and the downtown art scene. These provide a great overview and introduction to the kinds of sites our project documents and what LGBT history is all about. One of the biggest issues in preserving LGBT historic sites is a lack of historical context, and this can negatively affect a review board's ability to assess a site's significance at the city, state, and federal levels. To help fill this void for New York City, at least, we prepared a historic context statement that provides an overview of the city's LGBT history. Here you see a section exploring the development of Greenwich Village and Harlem as gay neighborhoods between the two world wars. The document also includes an evaluation framework section on how to apply National Register criteria to sites associated with LGBT history. This, for example, shows the apartment building where AIDS activist Larry Kramer lived and helped found the first AIDS advocacy group in the nation in the early 1980s. And these are the 10 sites in New York City that have been listed on the state and national registers for their significance to LGBT history. Two of our project founders worked on the 1999 Stonewall nomination, which was the first site in the country to be listed for LGBT significance. And our project team and consultants worked on the other nominations, except for the Bayard-Rustin residence. I should note also that we are currently working with staff at the Henry Street settlement on the Lower East Side to update its National Register listing to include the life and work of its founder, Lillian Wald. The settlement staff actually contacted us to do this after hearing about our work at the Alice Austin House, which is great. And I'll discuss more about Alice Austin in a bit. And it's not all about National Register listings, though. We partnered with the National Park Conservation Association to create this self-guided walking tour map of LGBT historic sites around Stonewall National Monument, which helped contextualize the 1969 Stonewall Uprising, as well as give visitors a much broader understanding of gay life and activism in the vicinity of the monument. A digital version is available on our website's resources page if you're interested in checking it out. Since we're limited in time today, I'm going to discuss just two of our National Register nominations in a bit more depth. The first is the Alice Austin House on Staten Island, which has been a house museum for over 50 years. The house was originally listed on the National Register in 1970 for its architecture, a Gothic revival cottage that was in Alice Austin's family for several generations. Austin was a pioneering female photographer at the turn of the 20th century, but the original nomination left out her partner of 53 years, schoolteacher Gertrude Tate. In fact, for much of its history as a house museum, Austin and Tate's relationship had been erased from the narrative. This, thankfully, is no longer the case, and the museum is now active in LGBT causes and serves as a model for cultural heritage sites in acknowledging LGBT people and their partners the same way we do for heterosexual couples. Here, Austin and Tate are pictured early in their relationship around 1905 and towards the end of their lives in 1944. Austin took many photos that were ahead of their time, leaving us striking images that have become especially meaningful to LGBT people who now have a visual link to their past. On the left is Austen's intimate portrait of Gertrude Tate, taken in the parlor of the house around 1900, and the other is a group portrait of Austen, who is standing on the left, and her two friends in male drag. This was taken outside the house. Owner consent is needed for a property to be listed on the National Register, as I'm sure many of you know, and this can be a challenge when an owner doesn't want to be associated with LGBT history. We've experienced this even in parts of New York City, but fortunately, the Alice Austen House's staff and board has worked in recent years to reinterpret its history to include Gertrude Tate, and they collaborated with us on this amendment. Here's a group of us from the project, the House Museum staff, SHPO, and the National Park Service celebrating the amendment at the House in June 2017. That same year, we nominated the commercial space in Greenwich Village to the National Register for its association with the Cafe Chino at 31 Cornelia Street, which operated here from 1958 to 1968. The Chino was an intimate cafe theater venue that was the birthplace of off-Broadway. Less often celebrated is its role as a pioneer in the development of gay theater, at a time when depicting homosexuality on stage was illegal. The Chino was owned and operated by Joe Chino, an openly gay man from Buffalo, New York, whose boyfriend also worked there as the electrician. Chino is standing with his sleeves up on the left in the group photo. For much of its history, the storefront was covered in posters that served both to advertise what productions were being performed and to hide what people, and specifically police officers, could see from the sidewalk. As I mentioned, depicting gay-themed works was illegal at this time. This photo is just a wonderful shot of what the interior looked like during that time. It was a tiny space where the cast and the audience were practically on top of each other, which was the intimate experience that Joe Chino intended. Another issue with nominating LGBT sites to the National Register is dealing with integrity issues for sites of social and cultural significance. This was never a grand interior and was never meant to be. And we were able to work with our SHPO contact, Kath LaFranc, to build a case for the Chino's significance, even with its modest interior. By 1965, the venue became particularly well known for its original gay-themed plays. This was due in large part to the Chino's breakthrough hit in 1964, The Madness of Lady Bright, which was an early play to deal explicitly with gay subject matter. Even in New York City, where LGBT people have long contributed to one of the city's most important industries, the theater, being able to see realistic, multidimensional gay characters was a rarity at this time. The Chino was therefore an important example of the arts as a powerful tool for social change. So I'll end by sharing some takeaways on the challenges of preserving LGBTQ history. These points are based on feedback from LGBTQ focus groups that the National Trust for Historic Preservation asked me to coordinate last month, and included cultural heritage professionals from around the country, including everyone on this panel today. So just some of the major points that were raised was the importance of having more National Register listings to help validate LGBTQ history. And in addition, many sites that already are on the register could be amended to include this history. The importance of recording LGBTQ histories outside major cities like New York City and San Francisco. The difficulty in getting someone's LGBTQ identity recognized by review boards for sites that are not LGBTQ specific. These mostly relate to sites of activism and bars that you most often see. So researchers are often told that there is a lack of evidence in identifying someone as LGBTQ. And as I mentioned earlier, there are interior integrity issues for sites of social and cultural significance, and the difficulty in obtaining owner consent, as I also mentioned. And I'm going to wrap up with one of our favorite project photos, which was taken at the beautiful Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, where we lead LGBT history tours and place rainbow flags at the graves of notable gay figures. This photo actually only represents half of the group that's there. The other half is watching with smiles behind the camera. And I think this shows just why documenting LGBT history matters, and why we hope the recognition of these sites continues to grow in the future and not just in New York City. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jeffry.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeffrey A. Free Harris. Professionally in the preservation world, I am known by my nickname of Free. And I wanted to speak with you all today in terms specifically about the importance of preserving African American LGBTQ historic places. And it's something that I have to admit was not what I thought would be in my wheelhouse when I was working on my Ph.D. in US history back in the late 1990s. The work that I did, the interest that I had in LGBTQ history was more about self-edification. It really was more, me sort of getting a sense of myself. I'd come out in the early 90s and I wanted to learn more about my individual history. But as my career turned away from academic history and more into public history and more specifically into historic preservation, I found that my training in the field of academic history and my interest and work in historic preservation worked beautifully together. And I was able to bring with me that which I thought was important to me personally, but I could bring it to my work. So one of the benefits that I had in being able to bring those two together was being invited to contribute a chapter to the National Park Service's LGBTQ themes study in 2016. And the chapter that I contributed was entitled Where We Could Be Ourselves, African American LGBTQ Historic Places and Why They Matter. And in that chapter, I really framed it as sort of a general sort of historical narrative over time, the time that we genuinely tend to look at African American LGBTQ history based on the evidence that we have. So beginning with the early 20th century with the blues era and then moving forward across the 20th century and into the 21st. That's the period that I basically covered. And in that process, I was able to talk specifically about not only the places that are African American focused that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places or National Historic Landmarks, but also I really focused some energy on the places that have been lost, because what we find all too often for LGBTQ historic places in general is that a lot of our sites are located in places that usually go through a great deal of change, neighborhoods that change. They're in areas that, over time we see that they are gentrified or they're torn down. So there's a great deal of loss that I wanted to make sure that my essay, that my chapter conveyed, in that we need to begin the process of identifying what we can find, make sure that we can landmark that which is still extant, and going forward, beginning the process of making sure that we do, pay attention to who is doing things that we know are historically relevant for LGBT future purposes. So what I wanted to do specifically, since I was, you all were nice enough to invite me to participate in this particular discussion, was to highlight the sites in New York that I wrote about. One beginning with Villa Lewaro in Irvington-on-Hudson. And Villa Lewaro was the home of the late Madam C.J. Walker, the impresario in terms of beauty products for African-American women. Its LGBTQ tie comes through her daughter, Alelia Walker. And Alelia Walker ultimately became one of the biggest patrons to those artists who were participating in the Harlem Renaissance. After her mother's passing, Alelia, who did enjoy same-sex couplings with several ladies over the course of her rather abbreviated life, sadly, she would invite the literati of the Harlem Renaissance out to Irvington to spend some time to get away from the city, to really sort of relax. And she developed many wonderful relationships with the likes of Langston Hughes and Elaine Locke and Wallace Thurman, Zoriel Hurston. So she was very much a part of that scene, but not from an artistic perspective. She really did help to sustain some of the livelihoods of a lot of the participants in the Harlem Renaissance. Her home was listed on the National Register and became a National Historic Landmark primarily because of the history of her mother, but also because it is an architectural gem in and of itself, which is sort of the traditional one of the traditional criteria that you often see for listings. So it had that high integrity. But that was one particular site, and it's an example of a place that does require looking at the history of the place and the people involved to find those African American LGBTQ stories tied to it. The next I wanted to highlight is James Baldwin's residence down in Greenwich Village. And of course, we all know who James Baldwin is, and Esquire magazine was brilliantly wonderful and timely in posting an article just the other day featuring a 1979 interview that he had given for 2020 that had been buried since 1979. So I talk about Baldwin, and at the time I wrote my piece, the James Baldwin, no site associated with James Baldwin had been listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So, come 2019, it's been wonderful to see this site move into that space of recognition nationally. And the last one that I'll feature is the Lorraine Hansberry residence, also in Greenwich Village. And again, at the time that I wrote my chapter, again, nothing associated with Lorraine Hansberry was on the National Register. Her family home in Chicago was recognized as a city landmark in Chicago years ago. But this particular site is very much the place where she, as a lesbian woman, doing her artistic work, doing her writing, this is where she really was able to blossom and do the work that we now know her for. And this home was just listed this year, 2021. So again, I just wanted to give you a nice little sample of the New York related sites that I actually talked about. I also brought up places like the founded site, though I don't know where it is, of gay men of African descent, which was an HIV, which I believe was the first African American men's HIV/AIDS organization that was established during the very beginnings of the HIV crisis to deal specifically with the issues of Black men dealing with HIV and AIDS. And as I noted earlier, going forward, what I advocate for is really trying to make it a point to continue to identify African American LGBTQ places wherever we can find them. Begin with the people that we know who are famous, go as far as you can to their hometowns. If we're, lots of people flee to large cities, but if you go to their hometowns and see if there's anything extant that, that still exists, begin the process of seeing if those places can be designated, if those places can be identified, as LGBTQ African American historic places, and work in that vein so that we can work with the history of what we know. But I also think that it's extremely important for us to think about those people that we know today and think about those individuals and even ask them on occasion to think about their legacies in terms of preservation. So we know RuPaul, look at Little Nas X, look at those people who are relevant today, who have done, amazing things, who are a part of our community, and make sure that as we talk to them, ask them about that preservation legacy. And, we won't find ourselves having to do what we're doing now for our further back history. We can go focus forward, and make sure that we've done this work. And with that, thank you very much. And from Free to Jeff, I'll pass the hat.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Jeffry Iovannone, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Gay Places, the initiative I co-founded with Preservation Buffalo Niagara. The blog series that Katie mentioned is a part of this. So I'm going to give an overview, and then I'm also going to talk about two LGBTQ historic sites from Western New York. So just a little information about PBN to start with. PBN's mission is to identify, protect, and promote our unique architecture and historic legacy and connect people to the places they love in Western New York. And the organization provides education, technical service, advocacy, and community development. So on to the Gay Places initiative, which is co-founded between myself and Christy Limnianis, who's the Director of Preservation Services at PBN. We started in June of 2020, so we are 1 year old. And this really came out of our desire to document more substantially LGBTQ historic sites in Western New York. And I really have to give Christy a lot of credit because she especially has pushed me in terms of my research into the LGBTQ community in Western New York to think more about place-based history. So our mission is as follows: to document, preserve, and celebrate LGBTQ historic sites in Western New York, to provide education about these sites and the people and events connected to them through academically defensible public history. So we very much see ourselves as a scholarly initiative. And to move from a bi-coastal narrative to a more holistic narrative of LGBTQ history using Western New York as a model or as one example. So to move from an understanding of LGBTQ history that focuses on large cities that exist on the East or the West Coast. And to this point, the late, great Buffalonian activist and historian, Madeline Davis, who was a supporter of the initiative. She came to our walking tour that we did, a virtual walking tour that we did this past fall. She would often say of the LGBTQ community in Western New York, our community has a past, but no history. And that's part of what we're trying to do here. And what she means is there's important things that happened in terms of the community, but we haven't necessarily incorporated that into our larger understanding of LGBTQ history as a whole. And significantly, there's no sites in Western New York on the National Register for Historic Places, specifically for their connection to LGBTQ history. However, that's something that we're working on remedying. So what did we do during our first year? As Katie mentioned, I wrote a blog series on historic sites in Western New York, and those initial pieces were published between June and July of last year. I have more coming this month. In October, we did a virtual walking tour. In the fall, this past fall, we started working on our first National Register nomination, which is the Peggy Ames House that I'll talk more about in just a minute. We presented our work on the Peggy Ames House at the Moving Trans History Forward Conference, which is hosted by the University of Victoria in British Columbia in March. And then in April, we did a more expanded webinar on that presentation. And then this month we've been especially busy. So we have two other things coming up. Next week, I'm giving a talk that's called Revolutionary Males that focuses on two queer Buffalonian activists, Charlie Haney and Jim Zeiss, and looking at their legacy through the lens of place. And then the week after that, an event that we're very excited about, a collaborative event with the NYC Sites Project from the Queen City to the Big Apple, where we're going to be talking about different LGBTQ sites from Western New York and New York City and placing them in conversation with each other. So that's what we did. And then where do we want to go? Ideally, we would like to create, to move beyond the blog series and create a more comprehensive website to serve as an educational resource and to build a more comprehensive knowledge of LGBTQ history in New York State and also beyond. And we see that website also including an interactive map and an oral history project that centers LGBTQ sites and the community stories connected to them, right? So that you could actually go to the website and read about a particular site, but then hear a community member tell a story about that site and how it impacted their experience or identity as an LGBTQ person. In-person walking tours, some additional National Register nominations or amending existing nominations. So some of the LGBTQ resources in Western New York are already located in historic districts, particularly Allentown and the West Village, but those nominations do not specifically reference LGBTQ history. And then ultimately, we'd like to build towards a historic context statement for LGBTQ history in Western New York. Okay, so to move on to the two sites, the Peggy Ames House, which I previously mentioned, which is located in Clarence, New York, which is a suburb of Buffalo. However, when Peggy Ames lived there, it was more of a rural community. This is a historic Greek Revival home. You can see two different views of the house itself and then a barn that's located on the back of the property. And Peggy Ames was an early trans activist from Western New York. Here's another view of the house and then just two maps that show that the property is located on the corner of Clarence Center Road and Railroad Street. And Peggy was the first out trans person in Western New York. She and her wife purchased the home in 1954, but she doesn't come out as trans until 1973. She was involved in the Mattachine Society of the Niagara Frontier, which is the first gay rights organization in Buffalo. And she was also significantly involved with the Erickson Educational Foundation, which is an early transgender foundation. And I'll talk more about her connection to that in a minute. And she was a primary advocate for trans issues in Western New York at this time throughout the 1970s. She did multiple speaking engagements, workshops, lectures, and to support herself, because she was rejected by her community, unfortunately, she opened a furniture restoration business called Pine Crafts, located in that barn in the back of the property. And here's a photograph of her in her craft shop from a profile that was written about her in the Buffalo Courier Express from 1978. And in this profile and in the community, she was sometimes referred to as the local Christine or the local Christine Jorgensen, but she was very adamant about the fact that though she really admired Christine Jorgensen as a trans woman who was living in a rural community, she thought her experience was quite different. And so she was also associated with the Gender Identity Clinic at Women's and Children's Hospital in Buffalo, which was founded by Drs. Anki Earhart, who's pictured here in an article about the clinic that she helps to establish at Children's, and her husband, Heino Meyer-Ballberg. They had come from Johns Hopkins, where they were working with John Money. And Dr. Earhart was on the board of the Erickson Educational Foundation. which is how Ames is able to make her connection to the foundation, founded by the independently wealthy trans man, Reed Erickson. Peggy was trained as a peer counselor through Mattachine, and she is able to get herself listed as a counseling resource on the Erickson Educational Foundation resource list. And as far as we know, she is the only singular trans person who is living in a rural setting who is on that list. The other trans people that were outside of medical providers on that list were fledgling trans organizations in New York City and San Francisco. And she used her home as the basis of this counseling work. So either trans people, particularly trans women, would come to the house and she would counsel them. She would do it over the phone, or she even sometimes provided trans women with temporary living accommodations if they were in need. And I should also say, quickly before I go on to the next site, the determination of eligibility for the Peggy Ames House is with New York State SHPO right now. And then secondly, I want to talk quickly about the Leslie Feinberg family home. So both of these sites relate to trans history. Leslie Feinberg was a trans writer, activist, labor organizer, was internationally known. And this is her family home. It's an example of a traditional Buffalo double or a two-flat residence. And so the Feinbergs lived in the bottom floor of the residence and they rented out the top floor. And their purchasing of this home in 1962 is representative of the upward mobility of Jewish Buffalonians. And so the house was located in North Buffalo. And from the 1950s to the 1970s, this area of North Buffalo was associated with Buffalo's working class Jewish community. Here's a picture of Feinberg, and I like to include this quote to show specifically how she defined what it meant for her to be transgender. And really looking into the Feinberg family home shows the power of place-based history, but also some of the difficulties when we're thinking about historic resources that are connected to trans history. So one of the things I was able to learn about the family in my research is their purchasing of this home really showed their upward mobility. They start out as working class, but end up being much more towards middle class, even though Leslie herself staunchly identified as working class throughout her life. And one of the funny things that a neighbor of the family who I interviewed told me was that the other wives in the neighborhood thought Mrs. Feinberg was kind of uppity because she had won this pageant, Mrs. Buffalo pageant, which was like a local branch of the national Mrs. America pageant, which is essentially like beauty pageant for homemakers, so that she had won this beauty pageant and that she had a fur coat. And this is significant because if we're thinking about Leslie, she makes it very clear in her writing, in particular her novel, Stone Butch Blues, that she was working class both because of deindustrialization in Buffalo in the 1970s, and also because of her gender nonconformity, right? So we see the confluence of trans identity and economic circumstances. And here's another photo of the Feinberg family. And interesting, Mrs. Feinberg was also a writer. She wrote several books about parenting. And this is a flyer from the book launch event for Stonebutch Blues, which took place in Buffalo. And so when we're talking about Feinberg, it certainly seems we should have some place on the National Register to commemorate her life, because as she said in her own words, Buffalo was where she found community, struggle, my voice, and pride, right? However, that's difficult when we're talking about someone who is both trans and working class and who never owned property in Buffalo, even though, right, the experiences that she had surrounding that family home were foundational to her. They very much shaped Stonebutch Blues, which is her most well-known work. And even though she would leave Buffalo for a time, she would come back, time and time again. So I think that this in particular is an example that shows that the criteria for the National Register was not constructed with working class trans folks in mind. Okay, and I will conclude there.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Larry Francer, and I will be your moderator for the rest of this session here. I want to thank the Preservation League for doing this and for bringing this great group together. As Katie mentioned, I'm the Associate Director of the Landmark Society of Western New York. The mission of the Landmark Society is to protect the unique architectural heritage of our region and promote preservation and planning practices that foster healthy, livable, and sustainable communities. The Landmark Society is one of the oldest and most active preservation organizations in the country. We were founded in 1937, which makes us older than the National Trust. So let's get going. We don't have any questions yet, but please put in questions. One thing that I wanted to bring up is about National Register listings and the Secretary of Interior standards. Amanda mentioned that all four of us were involved in discussions with the Park Service about the LGBTQ, preserving LGBTQ history. And one thing that came up a lot was about National Register listings. And I can just give you a little background on where we are in Rochester with that. When we first started our LGBTQ historic landmarks project, we got some funding through the LGBT Giving Circle at our community foundation. And I actually got a lot of pushback from them when I was talking about National Register listings, speaking at statewide conferences. They wanted something that really dealt with the community, that the community could get involved in. And I wasn't quite sure that I necessarily agreed with that completely, but as our project sort of unfolded, we realized that what we really did need to do was get the community involved. And what we did was we started doing some historic walking tours. Our tour started right about the time when past president, whose name shall not be spoken, was inaugurated. And it was that first Pride afterwards. And our tour was called Resistance in the 70s, Have We Come Full Circle? And we had over 100 people come to that first walking tour. And it was a really fabulous experience to get people involved, and we continue doing them. We've done 5 since. You can find them on our website, landmarksociety.org. But the question is, how important are the National Register listings for the community itself? Yes, we all agree that it's a great honor, but do most of the LGBTQ or anyone in Rochester know that much or care that much about National Register listings? So I'm just gonna throw that out to all of you. The first one who wants to talk about it first, take it away. Come on, somebody.
Sure, I'm happy to begin. There's no question in my mind that the honorific of a National Register listing is important to people, and I'm pulling from a general work experience with African American historic sites, generally speaking. It's that it's less the imprimatur of the national government or the state government, and more the idea that this is a place where the history that is reflective of your community is recognized, and that reflection goes back to the community itself. And again, this is from the work that I've done, mostly in African American related historic places, and I've found that it has extended, at least to people that I've spoken with, to African American LGBTQ folks as well. Again, that sense of recognition. So if you think about the point of pride of having Lorraine Hansberry, Bayard Rustin, James Baldwin now, when you start talking about the people who are known in the Black community who also happen to be LGBTQ, and then you find out their homes are also listed, there's a point of pride in that, because not only is that an assertion of their importance generally to the community, but it's also a reminder of saying that, hey, we're seen as well within the construct of this designation process that a lot of communities are learning or have familiarity with, but are now expanding it to are more outsider groups within the realm of Black folks. That's my take.
Thanks, Free.
Yeah, I think
else? Amanda, please.
I know. So there were 3 focus groups that we held for this for LGBTQ preservation, and the first group definitely was very much focused on National Register listings and the importance of validating LGBTQ history through these listings. And then other groups were people, like you said, people even know when I give tours, that doesn't really mean anything to them. But I do think, as Free mentioned, this acknowledgement of a National Register or a site being on the National Register to a community is really important. And I mean, in general, sometimes I wonder if people, regardless of historic places, people aren't really aware of history. In general, yet we still document it. It's still important to document and to share. And I would say the photo that I shared at the Alice Austin House, the group photo, the keynote speaker was Joan E. Byron, who was holding that image of Alice Austin and Gertrude Tate. In her speech, she was talking about the importance of seeing those images as a young, isolated lesbian, and her time when she did not know anybody else who was gay around her, or did not have a lesbian community, and to see those images were really significant to her. And for her to be at that site that day, to walk through that space, to know that it was being acknowledged as a place of lesbian history that had meant so much to her. It was, you could see, the importance of that. And I do think, having sites on the National Register, even if people don't really understand what that actually means, or they go to read the nominations, there is something about, if you see that plaque or you hear that it does mean something to people, even if it doesn't grab everybody.
Okay,
I'll just
Jeff, go ahead. Thanks.
I don't want to sound like a broken record, but Larry, I think what you're speaking to relates directly to what I talked about in terms of moving from a bi-coastal narrative to a more holistic narrative. And if we have sites in places like Buffalo or Rochester, right, that are listed on the National Register and have that sort of prestige and authenticity, it makes it much more, I think, difficult to ignore what happened outside of large cities on the coast, and then also allows us to start placing these different geographic regions in conversation with each other. And I think especially, in the context of walking tours and being able to go and visit some of these sites, especially with young people who are maybe from Western New York or from Rochester, I think that changes how they feel about and see themselves in terms of historical actors. And I know with my students, when I teach LGBTQ history, when I started incorporating the Western New York material right into the narrative that I typically teach, and I use the Sites Project website in my class, and I use Eric Marcus's Making a History podcast, but then also bringing in some of the material from Western New York. And a lot of the students are from Western New York or from upstate. They were just so thankful, right, that then they could see themselves in a different way, because they felt like people like them or people who are from places where they were from were then represented. So I think it has the possibility to change the narrative and the way that we think about doing LGBTQ history.
Great, thank you all. I mean, I surely, I'm not saying that, and our listings aren't important. My point was, and still is maybe, that besides preservationists and historians, how important is it? Yes, we should do them, we should continue doing them, but to the gay guy down the street or the lesbian around the corner, isn't it more important to take them on a walking tour and talk to them about it and explain it to them possibly? I think that is where you get them involved, and that's where they really start feeling, or, your site, Amanda, is amazing. And I mean, being able to click on all of those, regardless of National Register nominations, or I just think, it is letting people know about our history, and it doesn't always have to be as a National Register listing. Eventually it's nice, absolutely, it's great. And we can do some good PR, but I'm not sure everybody really cares that much, except for the preservationists and the historians. But we're going to leave that because there are tons of questions, unless somebody wants to throw something.
Can I just do a quick? I think it's both. I think it's both and. I really do, in that, you need the one in some ways to help shore up the work that we do, so that as more people learn about these places that, so many people don't know about, when it comes time for us to then do what we do as professionals in the preservation community, we've got backup from people who are like, oh, I remember that walking tour that I did. They're trying to put that on, they're trying to get that recognized for something now. We've got backup. So I think it's a both and, that we really can, it's a nice little circle that can be created there. And I'll leave that there.
Okay, great. I'm going to throw maybe an easy one out to you, and then I'm going to scroll down and find some of those more intense ones. But there's a question, which is the higher priority? Amending existing NR nominations to detail LGBTQ+ history in communities such as Buffalo and Rochester, or documenting and nominating new individual sites?
I don't see a hierarchy. I think either is valid, and adding a new listing is obviously really exciting. But I think amending a history or amending an older listing also sends a message that, you know, history is not fixed. We can go back in time and reevaluate and include narratives that were left out. And so that's what we've been doing both in New York City. And I mean, there are so many sites on the National Register that could be amended to include LGBTQ history, which just shows the impact that the community has had and the important narratives that there is to share. So I think both.
Anyone else? Jeff, being a Western New Yorker, we were specifically called out about, what do you think? You are still muted in case you're getting ready to talk.
I mean, I would have to agree with Amanda. I don't necessarily see a hierarchy, and I'll just say, like, for example, with the Peggy Ames house that we went to first in terms of the NR nomination, you know, that was our best site, both in terms of the history that's connected to it, and then also the fact that it's not located in existing historic district. So that's why we went with that particular resource first, but I don't necessarily see amending versus a new site, one being superior than the other.
And the most fun about the amendment is the revelation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's always that's the giggle for people. Like, wait, what? that person did that, and how amazing is that to be able to look back and to say, yeah, we were there, we were back there too.
Yeah, that's great, Free. I mean, that was sort of my take as well. I mean, you know, all of them are important, of course, but when you have a listing that does not mention anything about LGBTQ history and find out that there is something that you can amend and add to it, it's sort of that, aha, finally, you know, that type of thing, which I think is really, really cool. Let me see. I have got, I'm not sure any of us can answer this, but it's a good point and maybe someone can come through. There's been a lot of great steps at a national level to raise awareness of LGBTQ history and preservation, most notably through the National Context Statement and the Underrepresented Grant Program. But is there anything happening at the national level to help advance this work being done in Middle America? The cities on the coast have access to more money so they can get a lot of this work done, but everyone in between is struggling to get pennies. Any comments on that?
Well, that is something that was raised during the focus groups, because we did have representatives from all over the country, which was really great. People from the Midwest, the South, and so it wasn't just San Francisco and New York City. There is a statewide historic context statement for Kentucky, which is really interesting and I think could be a great model. They looked at both urban areas and rural areas and the challenges of doing both. And then we, I mean, our project, we have a resources page where we have other projects and like online resources that are happening in other cities and other places. But yes, this is something that it would be great to direct funding to help look at other places so that it's not just, you know, the 2 or 3 places that we often think of associated with LGBTQ history.
Right.
Actually, I'm in the beginning stages after a year postponement for the obvious reasons of putting together an historic context study for Raleigh, North Carolina, an LGBTQ context study for Raleigh, North Carolina. So, you know, that if a smaller, you know, city in the South can do it like Raleigh, then, you know, that is, it's getting there. It's getting there, which is true.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it possibly lands on the shipboats. And we're very lucky in New York. We have a really strong shipboat that there was a point that came up in the questions that I just want to say about how the New York shippo deals with it. And I don't see it. Maybe some have been dismissed. Anyway, they do a great job. So, Katie, do we still have a little time?
Yeah, so we're about at time, but there are so many questions that I would love to hear y'all's answers to. So if you all are cool hanging on for a few more minutes, I would love to give you the floor for a few more questions.
Great, good. Thank you, Katie. Everybody good? Yeah, shaking heads? Good. Okay, so this is one, I think, specifically for Jeff. And the question was, are you doing anything regarding Liz Kennedy? Dr. Kennedy was one of the founding feminists of the field of women's studies and is a lesbian historian whose book, Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, A History of the Lesbian Community, documents the lesbian community of Buffalo, New York in the decades before Stonewall. Take it away, Jeff.
So in terms of gay places thus far, we have not. And so the reason for that is right when everyone thinks about LGBTQ history in Buffalo, right, we think about Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, and Stone Butch Blues. And of course, Liz Kennedy, Nalin Davis's book only goes up until 1965. It only looks at the lesbian community. So in my work, I've been interested in, well, what happens next? What happens after 1965? How does the community evolve? However, in terms of moving towards a more comprehensive history and working towards that historic context statement, we're going to have to, of course, look at and incorporate the bars that they documented in that book. However, one of the issues is, and Christy, please correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, only one of the bars that they document in Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold is still extant. Everything else has been demolished, unfortunately. Many of them are parking lots. Yes, and Christy says correct, almost everything else is gone.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you. I have another question. Are there attempts to include LGBTQ Latinx, Asian American, Filipino American, etc. in these communities? It's not just a black and white binary. Any comments?
Well, as far as, is this for like National Register or just documenting in general?
I figure, let's say in general.
In general, well, on our website, we're always looking for more sites that represent the full diversity of the community. We do have a number of them that, especially in Jackson Heights and Queens, which is, it has a very important long-time Latino community. And then we have a few Asian sites, sites associated with Asian Americans. But we are also always looking to expand. And sometimes you come across a site and it's demolished, which is really disappointing. But yes, as far as we concerned, we are documenting, but always looking for more.
And as a former director for diversity for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, trust and believe, I'm looking for this context study that I'm going to be doing for Raleigh, everything. Anything that I can find from any community that, you know, had LGBTQ plus representation in the city's history, I will make sure that that is included within that historic context study. And I'm confident that there are a lot of us who do this work who are much more attuned now to make sure to include the full panoply of us who are part of the LGBTQ plus realm.
Okay, this may be the last one. Let's see how much we can get. We may have one more that we can do, but this was actually one that that struck me as well. Speaking of inclusivity, any comment on using the term LGBTQ as opposed to LGBTQIA2S or other variants in your organization or project names? Amanda, has your organization been criticized for not being more inclusive in your naming?
Well, I know people have asked about, there have been some people who've asked, we haven't gotten a lot of that. We found the project name was created in 2015, 2014 when the grant was given from the National Park Service. And as we know, terminology continues to evolve. So we keep that in mind. We hope that we're being inclusive and trying to think of as many different types of sites that we can to document. But the terminology is obviously very personal, and we try to do our best that way.
Okay. Anyone else have a comment on that? No. Okay. Now this probably is the last one. And thanks to Kath LaFranc, what SHPO says is, we list everyone's history, New York State SHPO. We list everyone's history. Thank you, Kath, and thanks for all your great work. So this is a little lengthy. I can read pretty fast. I am focused on the story of Elsa Gidlow, whose home in Marin County, California, has recently been listed on the register. I understand that an apartment in New York City in which she lived has recently been given local recognition. My question is concerning Elsa's recognition as a figure of California, but not national importance, to use National Park Service parlance. It is my opinion, formed from my 6 years of research, that Elsa is an LGBTQ figure of national importance, and I hope to assert this to the powers that be in the National Park Service. Since there are several buildings, some quite interesting architecturally, which are soon to be in ruins at her home called Druid Heights, I am wondering if changing Elsa's designation from a figure of California importance to one of national importance might force the National Park Service to preserve her home and other outbuildings. I understand you can give no firm opinion, and I would appreciate your best guesses. Thank you. Who wants to take that one?
I'm of the mind that if the history bears that out, there's your argument for national figure status, and just look for the documentary evidence that supports that and make your case. I mean, that's the argument that's an argument I would probably take up, especially if the person that we're talking about is, has history in literally on either coast. And you can talk about the impact that person has had in more than one place. Even you start, I hope I'm making some sense. If you start planting seeds and doing things that are of significance and relevance, then and can go, yeah, I did this here, I did that there. Then to me, that's as strong an argument as a person who's done something significant in one place. At least that's right. How I would argue it.
And Daniel McKay put in the question, as well as the chat, if you all didn't see it, national important would make the property eligible for Save America's Treasures funding. So that was, he felt, an important point. Maybe, I think we're doing pretty good. Let's see, what do you think? Katie?
Yeah, I think we're about at time, but I want to give you all a chance to have final thoughts. Anything you want to leave our guests with anything that you think they should be looking out for as we move forward and try to be more inclusive and tell more LGBTQ stories in preservation, because, you know, it's a vibrant part of our country and important to our history, and a traditionally marginalized community like the LGBTQ community, you know, sometimes doesn't always get the recognition it deserves. And I know you all are working hard to change that. So as we move forward and look to how we can be better advocates, anything you want to leave people with?
Why don't we go in reverse from where we started? So Jeff, why don't you start?
I'm just going to plug our events again. So if you would like to attend Revolutionary Males or our collaborative event with the Sites Project, where I'm sure we'll be discussing more of these issues, you can either go to PBN's website or their Facebook page and register for the events through there. And I hope to see some of you there.
Great. And Jeffrey, you're next.
A recommendation that I would give to folks, particularly those who want to identify LGBTQ historic places that are outside of, say, the major cities and the coast, think about where all of the people who have become famous have come from, and then go backward and document where they've come from, because that history of where they've come from led them to go to where they ended up. But that history is probably still relevant. So that, I think, could be a really good way to begin the process of creating some balance out there, because everybody is not from New York, DC, San Francisco, Los Angeles. They're from other places and they've shown up, and start from there. If you go that way, then, you know, we can expand that market naturally.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I think we're looking at cultural heritage professionals, just continuing to, you know, if you're doing historic neighborhood surveys, or looking at a history that's not LGBTQ specific, but has that history in it, to please include it, to you know, look to resources and maybe just challenge yourself to think about how that is really vital in the story of the site and how it can impact the community, whether it be a National Register listing or a blog post, you know, just to recognize that this is significant history and that it matters, and that it doesn't deserve to be hidden. It deserves to be shared with the public, and the benefits of that is what we've seen is really remarkable. The way that people respond to this history, or whatever acronym we use for the community, just to see the response of people and how people are empowered by this history. And I said earlier, specifically by LGBTQ we've spoken to know that they have this history growing up in environments where they may not have others around them. It's really empowering. So I would just encourage people to continue to think about how these stories can be incorporated in the buildings we document.
Great. And if I can just add one thing at the end here, I really have become a great proponent of the walking tour. And as we you know, lived through this pandemic, at one point we were able to do a Zoom walking tour, which actually included a little live video because we could get out at that point, but people weren't going to be with us. And we've got that on our website. And I was really, really pleased to see when Amanda presented that you've got that walking tour of Greenwich Village, because as much as I love your site, I'm like, oh my God, like this is way up here and this is way down there. And how do I really get to see it? And it was like really exciting to see that you have that walking tour on there now. And I think it's just getting the community involved. And I think when you can, you know, pull them in, and especially once we're getting, you know, back out there face to face, those are the things that really get people excited.
Great. Thank you all so much. I so appreciate your time, your expertise, and I'm just grateful for the work that you're doing and the fact that you shared it with us today. So thank you all. For everybody tuning in, I really encourage you to follow up on everything these folks are doing. Their work is great and they are excellent resources. And thank you for coming. I hope that you can join us for another program in the future. A couple of these people mentioned James Baldwin, and we are actually reading Go Tell It on the Mountain this month for our Preservation Book Club. So to tie into Amanda and Free's presentations earlier. And like I mentioned, our excellence awards are open. So, you know, if you know of excellence. But yeah, thank you for tuning in. Thank you all for being here, and find us on the internet, and we hope to see you at another program soon.